Alleviation in Africa. You are invited to contribute to the discussions today by asking questions. As already mentioned, you can do so by posting your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. Before we start with the presentation and discussions, Alexander Buck, IUFRO's Executive Director, will address you on behalf of IUFRO. He will explain the institutional background of the scientific work that is being presented today. Alexander, can I ask you to take the floor and give your welcome address to us?
Yeah, thank you very much, Christoph. A warm welcome once more to all of you on behalf of IUFRO, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations, and warm greetings from Vienna, Austria, where IUFRO's headquarters is located. IUFRO is the global network for forest science collaboration. It maintains a network of about 600 member organizations, which represent approximately 15,000 scientists around the globe. But IUFRO not only provides a structure for science collaboration, but also works very actively at the science policy interface. As a member of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, IUFRO forms an integral part of the so-called International Arrangement on Forests. Within the CPF, IUFRO leads and coordinates the Global Forest Expert Panels Initiative, in brief, GFEP. GFEP compiles and analyzes scientific information on forest-related issues of high global concern and provides comprehensive, independent, peer-reviewed reports to relevant international political forums to support evidence-based decision-making. In this way, GFEP contributes very actively to the implementation of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Past GFEP reports already addressed several of its sustainable development goals, including the ones on climate change, water, and food security. IUFRO's GFEP program also developed the global study on forest and poverty, which we are discussing today. And obviously, it's my sincere hope that the scientific evidence provided in this comprehensive report will inform discussions by decision makers and help to recognize the role of forests and trees in poverty alleviation. And as such, I hope the report can also make a meaningful contribution to a successful implementation of Sustainable Development Goal number 1. I wish you a successful side event and thank you a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for setting the scene and for welcoming our participants on behalf of IUFRO. We will now hear the keynote presentation, Forestries and the Eradication of Poverty, Potential and Limitations. And I'm very pleased to introduce to you Professor Daniel C. Miller, the chair of the expert panel on forest and poverty. Dan Miller is Associate Professor at the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences of the University of Illinois. Please post your questions to him during his talk or after his talk in the Q&A box. We will address them, as many of them actually, as time allowed after the presentation. Professor Miller, could I ask you for a presentation, please?
Thank you, Christoph and Alexander. And thanks to all of you for joining. It's a beautiful spring day here on the campus of the University of Illinois. And I know people are joining from many different places around the world, including at the UN in New York. It's really my pleasure to share what is joint work from the Global Forest Expert Panel on this really critical topic of forestries and poverty globally. So the starting point for this discussion is that poverty remains one of the greatest challenges of our time. 1 out of every 10 people still lives in extreme poverty, that is defined by the World Bank as living on less than $2 or $1.90 a day. You can see it in the figure to the right. At the same time, that's a very minimal threshold. 2/3 of people on Earth live on less than $10 a day. And even in many wealthier countries in Europe and North America, the poverty rate is 10 to 15%. And we highlight that poverty is not only economic, but has many dimensions, including health, social relations, and other aspects of human well-being. And the COVID-19 pandemic, which explains in part the structure for this very session, is exacerbating poverty in different ways all across the world. So in response to poverty as a challenge, the United Nations has agreed on its top goal to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. It's the first of these goals, 17 of them. We're now well underway for the implementation period, with heading toward 2030. And the first target within the overall goal is the eradication of extreme poverty. So strong focus on that. But then if you look at the 5 targets underneath that Sustainable Development Goal number 1, several of them concern forests and the natural world, including Target 4, which is about rights to land and natural resources, and Target 5, which is about the resilience of the poor in the face of shocks and disasters. Globally, there is substantial overlap between forests, trees, and poverty. 1/4 of the world's people live within 5 kilometers of a forest, and more than 1 billion people, many of them living below the international poverty line, and even more living under the threshold of $10 a day, derive direct and indirect benefits from forests and trees, as you can see here from this map. So this begs the question, what is the potential for forests and tree-based systems to contribute to SDG number 1? We recently, late last year, released a report summarizing our findings of a global assessment. And the heart of the report is about the relationship between forests and tree-based systems. So we're talking also about trees outside of forests and poverty. And we hasten to highlight that it's human action and forest-related interventions that will affect this relationship. At the same time, we need different ways to conceptualize and understand that relationship. We need to understand the current evidence, and we need to also understand the broader context within which forest and poverty relationship unfolds. And so that's what the other chapters of the report dealt with. And you'll hear from several of the co-authors in this webinar later today. I want to, though, give you 5 key messages from the report. First is that, and this is the bottom line finding, that forests and trees are critical to ending poverty worldwide. Evidence suggests that forests contribute up to 25% of household incomes in many tropical countries, and that forests and trees provide goods and services that are vital to supporting human well-being, building assets so that the poor can move themselves out of poverty, and also help manage risks across seasons and also across time and years. The second key message is that the benefits from forests are not evenly distributed, that forest poverty relationships are dynamic, and that these dynamics vary across time. So there can be benefits in the near term, and they might be different from those in the long term. So we might have more ecological benefits perhaps in the near term and not see social ones related to jobs, etc., until the longer term. The dynamics also vary across geographies, that inequalities continue to persist and in fact are widening both within and across countries. And then these dynamics vary across contexts, relating to gender context, class, ethnicity, political, and then other social differences that benefit how the benefits that shape how the benefits from forests are distributed. The third key message is that forests and trees can help the poor face profound global changes. I think the pandemic is bringing this home very decisively, but in addition to infectious disease, climate change, widening inequality affect the poor often the most harshly. And forest goods and services can help secure their well-being. To do so, it's crucial to integrate policy approaches across sectors while helping to mitigate the risk for the poor and then addressing at the same time other development challenges. Fourth key message is that inadequate land uses may lead to excessive costs being borne by the poor. So the overexploitation of forests, such as seen here, pose a serious threat to the poor in many circumstances. And some policies may further exacerbate those threats and add pressures to smallholders. And it's also true that the poor are often not able to capture the bulk of benefits from forests for a variety of reasons. The fifth key message is a more hopeful one, and that is that there are, in fact, our global assessment found that there are measures that exist to enable forests to address poverty. So agroforestry, community forest management, and ecotourism, among others, have been shown to effectively alleviate poverty. We hasten to add, however, that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that decision makers will need to embrace complexity and consider the trade-offs in different contexts. So what are the implications for decision makers? First, our report suggests the importance of just basic recognition, and it won't be surprising to this audience, but the importance of forests and trees for poverty alleviation. And then second, after recognizing the importance, to then prioritize policies that conserve and sustainably manage forests and tree-based systems. The evidence is very clear and growing stronger that secure property rights, particularly for the forest-reliant poor and indigenous peoples, is especially important to unlock the benefits that forests have. There's also a need to tailor policies and programs to different contexts and design them so that they mitigate inequality. Strengthening policy alignment in the land use and forest sectors is also very important to enhance both poverty alleviation and other sustainability goals. Now, we found several knowledge gaps. Here I highlight a couple. So there's still a need to continue to build our understanding on this topic. Some key questions are, how might forests and trees help the poor move out of poverty over the long term, and also prevent the non-poor from slipping into poverty? There are questions about which type of approach might be most appropriate in which circumstance. And then finally, how can barriers to more just and sustainable use of forests and trees be overcome? Critical question. So in conclusion, forest and tree-based systems can help address one of the most pressing challenges of our time, alleviating poverty in a way that is just and sustainable over the long term. And yet forests and trees are often overlooked in mainstream development policy discussions. So the implication is that now is the time for these foundational assets to take a more central role in advancing global poverty and sustainability goals. I thank you for your attention, and I believe we have some time for questions and answers before we then hear from a number of my colleagues who have helped to prepare this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this very comprehensive overview of the findings of the Global Forest Expert Panels on Forest and Poverty. I think this was a lot of food for thought, and I invite you now to post your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. I see a question here. Then how could forest-focused programs and social development programs join forces to optimize the scarce economic resources invested in such programs?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, sure. How could forest-focused programs and social development programs join forces to optimize the scarce economic resources invested in such programs?
That is a really challenging, excellent question. I think one of the things that I would come back to is the importance of social development programs that prioritize local community rights. I think from having the rights to forest and tree-based resources, other good things will flow. And that's what the evidence is telling us. There's also some very interesting work being done to prioritize payments. So green payments related to forest conservation that then can have knock-on effects. But this is just an absolutely crucial question. And I think we're seeing a lot of ferment and creativity in how it's being addressed in different contexts around the world. And I think just because I'm representing one perspective, I think it's the kind of question we might open up to some of our collaborating colleagues on the call who might have some specific examples that could be given.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. Why don't we invite our panelists to take the floor on this question? Who would be willing to have a go on that? Maybe, can I ask Priya?
You know, I think I was about to say rights. That is the entry point for many good things, as Jan said. But I'm thinking about supply chains, for instance. You know, they are incredibly important for what will happen to forests in many parts of the world, or what happens to forests in many parts of the world. And I think to the extent that sort of agencies, both government and non-government, that are working with smallholders around the world in forested landscapes, can build skills amongst these communities to participate and be empowered by market forces. Because markets will be in and out and affect both their lives and how forests stay healthy or otherwise. But communities could potentially seize the opportunity offered by forests, but they need skills, they need access to credit, they need secure rights. And so sort of building those skills into programs that when that work with smallholders is just one other example that I can think of.
Thank you very much, Priya. We have another question on the screen for Dan. It's also not the easiest one. What do you think will be the greatest challenge of the forest poverty relationship in the near future, considering the climate and global changes?
Yeah, I think there will be there is and there will continue to be growing threats to forests themselves. And I think just at that basic level, the demands for land use, the demands, as Priya was mentioning, for commodities, land is getting more and more expensive. So I think just the basic continued viability of forests, and not all forests are the same. Mm-hmm. We have tremendous diversity of forest types around the world along a forest transition curve, as well as different ecological zones. And so I think perhaps we start there with the threats that there are to sustainable forest management and conservation of the world's forests. So I think just having forests as an asset to work with is probably the near-term starting point, and will be an ongoing struggle, of course.
Thank you very much, Dan. I do not have any other questions on my screen at the moment. And I suggest that we will continue with statements of our panelists now. They will present the scientific evidence on specific aspects of the linkages between forest and poverty. Again, please post your questions to the speakers in the Q&A section again, and they will be addressed after their presentations. Our first panelist is Dr. Monica Gabay. Dr. Gabay is an independent researcher at the National University of San Martin, Argentina, and the coordinator of IUFRO's Division 9 on Forest Policy and Economics. She was a coordinating lead author of the assessment report and will explain to us the contextual factors shaping forest poverty dynamics. Please, Monica, you have the floor.
Thank you, Christoph. It's a very ambitious thing to claim I will explain the contextual factors. I'll give you some hints of what we're looking at with my colleagues. And the first thing is, why are we looking at context when it seems that everything has been said and done about context? Well, we're looking at context because contextual factors are the forces that shape the forest poverty dynamics. And if we do not take into account these forces, the policy measures that my colleague Rim Hajar will comment on the next presentation would have very different outcomes, certainly. So we need to look at these contexts or these factors. So how did we identify these factors? We went through a literature review and we have a series of discussions in meetings until we came up with these factors you're seeing on the screen, which we deem are the most critical ones we need to consider. And although we classify them into environmental context, social context, economic context, and political and policy contexts, the reality is that these frontiers between them are really fuzzy. So you will see some factors that straddle across different dimensions of this situation. And the interesting thing is that if we look at the causal pathway through which these factors appear to interact with the forest poverty dynamic, you will see that these factors can either act in a synergistic way with policy interventions, or they might produce trade-offs. And that's a very significant situation in which, for instance, say you're looking at ecosystem or ecological tourism or ecosystem-based tourism in protected areas, and you build a road to facilitate access to this protected area. Some unintended consequences would include, for instance, increased deforestation as there is an improved access to areas that were more remote and less accessible. You could also produce an increased income for local communities, which is really good. While you can also produce, go beyond the capacity, the carrying capacity of that protected area, and then produce some environmental or some biodiversity degradation. So it's very important to consider each of the factors while designing this policy measure. And that brings me to some ideas or key messages that we have. It's that, just as Professor Miller pointed out, there is no one size fits all for policy interventions, but these interventions should consider space, time, and also the differences in scale. So an intervention might be designed at the international scale, like REDD+, but then it has to travel across contexts to a local implementation. And this voyage of the policy intervention until it's tailored to suit a specific context might produce different outcomes from those intended in the first place, such as out-migrations, or because the measure has been enforced in a way that local communities are driven out of their ancestral territories. Or you might wish to empower women with a more secure land tenure and then do not take into account customary law, which in some places forbids women to being owners or proprietors of land. And this conflict would mean that although in paper women are entitled to tenure, they will not have it effectively because of customary law. And this is a cultural change that needs to be considered. So few last remarks, so I give space for questions, is that forest and tree-based landscapes are very complex socio-economical ecological systems that are in continuous change and dialectically interacted with policy measures. And the factors that affect these forest poverty dynamics are forces that sometimes are external to the local forest communities, such as international processes, that also influence larger scales than these local communities. And there are also, for this reason, you need to take into account the different levels, like the international, national, and subnational, which sometimes makes things complicated in terms of coordination. And also that the factors can produce different effects throughout the pathway of the causal chain. So these interventions should consider also both direct and indirect drivers to have a more precise view of the outcomes that might come out of those interventions. And finally, just a word on taking into account this cultural diversity, which also is interlinked with biological diversity, also the biodiversity and the policy sphere. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. I think we all got now an idea how complex these contextual factors are. And again, I invite you to post your questions in the Q&A box. We will continue with our second panelist, Professor Reem Hachar. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society of the Oregon State University, and also served as a coordinating lead author of the study. Professor Hachar will present the outcomes of an analysis of effectiveness of diverse forest management policies, programs, technologies, and strategies. Reem, you have the floor.
Thank you. So given that context, that broader context that Monica just presented on, we've been implementing a series of initiatives, policies, laws, programs in the forest sector, what we're calling here levers. And we've been implementing, well, various actors have been implementing them, governmental actors, intergovernmental organizations, donors, et cetera. And many of these levers in forest and tree-based systems have been implemented primarily because they were concerned with forest conservation or forest management, but many also aim to improve human well-being or reduce poverty, either as a primary goal or a secondary goal. So our objective with this chapter was to, based on the available literature, to assess which of these forest-related levers have been effective in alleviating poverty. And so our team came up with a list of these 21 different forest-related levers. And I organize them here under these 4 categories, mostly for simplicity and navigation, because some of these levers could technically be placed in multiple categories. So we have 4 different rights-based levers. So these are levers revolving around either giving or giving back to different groups new rights to access, use, or benefit from the forest. 4 levers, sort of additional regulatory levers focusing on laws and regulations. A series of market levers. These are voluntary mechanisms based on markets or commercialization of forests or forest products or some services. And then finally, 2 sort of interventions that directly involve forest and tree management. And so for each of these 21 levers, we assess the available evidence on how it has affected poverty. So I'll just highlight some of the results we found. The report details the evidence we found for each of these levers. I'll just go through a couple of highlights here. So in terms of the strongest evidence for poverty reduction, so here we're talking about moving people out of poverty, moving them above a certain threshold poverty level and keeping them there. The strength of evidence is actually limited to just 4 different levers. But when I say strength of evidence here, I mean based on the number, the quality, and the rigor of available studies. So not that many levers, right? Community forest management, protected areas when ecotourism is present, ecotourism, and agroforestry. That's where we found the strongest evidence for poverty reduction. But the list of effective levers gets longer if you're looking for evidence of poverty mitigation. So this is, levers that are supporting people's well-being without necessarily moving them out of poverty for the long term, right? So these levers are contributing to incomes, to assets, to other aspects of well-being, to their livelihoods. So the list gets much longer here. Some of the levers that aren't highlighted here yet, like Red Plus, we did find some evidence for their contributions to poverty mitigation, but the results were inconsistent or highly context dependent. Several of these levers are actually reliant on other levers for them to work. So for example, market access, it's not highlighted here yet because on its own, we didn't find any evidence for it contributing to poverty mitigation. But market access is also a really important enabling condition for several of the other levers to work, like community forest management. So on its own, it doesn't ensure success, but it is important in the larger context. So this really highlights the interreliance of several of these levers, as well as the contextual factors that we heard about earlier. So broadly summarizing, there is a fair amount of evidence that several levers are contributing to poverty mitigation, but we see much less evidence of poverty reduction. However, when we say much less evidence, it's important to keep in mind that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, right? So this is a really important point. It's possible that other levers are reducing poverty, but we're just not doing a great job of tracking that. There are fewer studies that are set up to specifically track poverty reduction over time, or that were specifically designed to measure impacts on poverty over time or at larger scales. Several of these levers have very strong theories of change of how they could be affecting poverty reduction, but we're not capturing that evidence yet. So it's harder for us to come up with definitive conclusions. So definitely more research is needed here that's designed specifically for that purpose of tracking poverty reduction over time. And the last point I wanted to make is that, as Dan mentioned here, across the board, we are seeing studies that show differentiated impacts, right? Where certain groups are able to capitalize on benefits coming from these levers more than others, or a lever is just exacerbating existing inequalities in populations. So that's something else we should really be keeping track of in order to carefully design policies or interventions so that they minimize these unintended effects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reem, for your presentation. As our third panelist, I'm very pleased now to introduce Dr. Priya Shamsudar. Dr. Shamsudar is the lead economist at the Nature Conservancy in Washington, D.C., and she's also one of our coordinating lead authors of the GFEP report and will address the implication of global forces of change for the alleviating poverty and sustaining forests. Priya, you have the floor.
Hello, everybody. I will pick up on some of the issues that Dan mentioned and Monica did. Global economic, political, social, and environmental forces can have a profound impact on local poverty, the forms that poverty takes, and the pathways in and out of poverty. So my co-authors and I were tasked to try and identify some of the major global forces, so the context now is global, that might affect 4 communities and forest landscapes, and identify how they might affect these 4 communities. How would they affect forest poverty dynamics? So we did deep dive into this question, and through a series of discussions and engagement with the literature, we identified 6 global forces that we think have a profound impact on forest poverty dynamics. The first is continued growth in commodity markets, more specifically markets related to timber, beef production, soy, and oil palm, which have an impact on large areas of forests and therefore on the communities that live around and within them. Climate, of course, somebody asked a question related to it. Climatic changes will affect how trees and entire ecosystems change and the services they deliver, and result in extreme events, which we know affect the poor inordinately more than the non-poor. There are trends in private and public financing that are important. Our understanding based on the available data is that public financing is either stagnant or declining, but we might be seeing an increase in private funding for forestry related to impact investments and growth in volunteer forest carbon markets. As all of you know, technological advances have made a huge change on how we live. And this is true even for remote communities, though maybe less so than in urban areas. But remote sensing technologies have changed the way forests are monitored. And social media has enabled communities, even rural remote communities, to connect with each other and bring their own narratives out for the rest of the world to hear. Global social political movements, both sort of political movements, but also the responses that we've been seeing to the increased inequality in the world or to climate change. These are global interconnected movements that help each other. And that is a trend that is important. And of course, emerging infectious diseases. We are living in a pandemic. We know how profoundly the current pandemic has changed all of our lives. And these and sort of the expectation of more pandemics in the future have deep implications for how forest poverty dynamics. So what we did to try and understand this very complex set of changes and the implications of these changes was to work through each of these 6 global trends, understand the implications of these trends for sort of forest poverty dynamics and 4 aspects of forest poverty dynamics. How do these trends help people move out of poverty? Do they increase poverty? Do they enable people to maintain and support their well-being? Or do they act as safety nets and reduce transient poverty? For instance, commodity markets, you can think about the income effects of these commodity markets, which they may actually enable smallholders to increase their incomes if they're able to catch on to the coattails of the market. But they're also increasing it. There are market risks that increase, and they increase the risk of land grabbing. And that has different implications for forest poverty dynamics. Similarly, technological changes, the improvements in monitoring can have a positive or a negative impact on local communities and their use of forests. But where technology enables clarity of rights, we assume that that is a positive impact. Where it improves social networking and has sort of this boomerang effect that it sort of allows people to get their voices heard in multiple places, that we think will have a positive impact. So these are we worked through each of these to identify both the positive and negative impacts. And where we landed, unfortunately, was an understanding that if you have a business as usual scenario, while these global forces offer some opportunities, the risks they offer in combination with the fact of the reality of the lives of poor people, limited rights, limited resources, limited skills. This combination of what they have with the fast changes that global forces bring is likely to increase poverty. So in a business as usual scenario, we think poverty will increase. But there is hope. There are reforms that are already being undertaken and that need to be pushed through further in order to move to an improved scenario where poverty can actually be reduced through the help of these global forces. Commodity supply chain reforms to increase transparency in how these commodity supply chains work. Democratizing the use of technologies. Technologies work best for experts. How can we make these technologies work for poor communities? Land rights reforms, we've talked about that a lot. One Health interventions that enable support for new supply chains so that the poor are not affected by pandemics so much and the risk of pandemics can be decreased. Investments in climate adaptation. And of course, most importantly, support for global social movements that boost the voice of the forest-reliant poor. I think these are the different ways in which we can flip the system to enable the poor to gain from these large-scale exogenous global changes. Thank you. And over to you, Christoph.
Thank you very much, Priya, for this excellent explanation of the implications of these global forces of change. We already got some questions for our panelists, and I will continue with a question to Reem. One of the common poverty alleviation strategies in developing countries is conditional cash transfers. How do you think this affects forests, and are there potential opportunities for this as a lever?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a few kinds of conditional cash transfers that fit into our scope of levers, and those are payments for ecosystem services where people are getting money to perform or based on their performance in terms of conserving forests. And for that, the PES schemes, those are actually some of the schemes that are best studied. We have some very well-designed studies that have tried to sort of isolate their impact on poverty alleviation. And results are mostly just neutral in terms of people aren't becoming any worse off, but they're not necessarily improving in terms of their poverty status. In one or two studies that do show sort of increases in poverty reductions in poverty, those found very small effects, although they were statistically significant effects. But then there's a whole other class of conditional cash transfers that aren't forest related at all. And so those didn't come into our analysis necessarily because we were really focused on forest related levers. But other things like Brazil's cash transfer programs, I don't know off the top of my head the evidence for those in totality, but I do know that there's one study found that it increased incomes in Brazil over 50% for agricultural reliant people. There's another program in Indonesia that was part of a very nice rigorous study that also found that it decreased deforestation substantially, these cash transfer programs. But I think in terms of looking at the combination of forest conservation, effects on forest conservation and poverty, I'm not aware of studies that have looked at that, but that doesn't mean they're not out there. So I think there's potential there when we see that they are working for poverty alleviation, they can work for forests. So that's definitely something to be looked into further.
Thank you very much, Reem. I do have another question. I might ask Monica to start to respond to it, and the other panelists might jump in. Is the increasing globalization of markets a threat or an opportunity for the capacity of forests to alleviate poverty? Monica, may I ask you to start off with a response?
Yes, so increasing globalization of markets, there's a big distance between local forest communities and a global market, but we can connect to, for instance, local community forest enterprises, small, medium forest enterprises that sometimes are connected with larger enterprises, providing services or inputs for those. And in that way, they might connect to global markets. in that sense, this might be an opportunity to improve the situation. As Reem mentioned, secure land tenure, and also Priya mentioned that one. You need secure land tenure to make investments in infrastructure, so these small, medium forest enterprises can produce better and have a better capacity to connect. That might be one way in which global markets might help to alleviate poverty. And I don't know if you wish to chime in.
Yes, I mean,
one thing. Oh, sorry.
Yes, please. Who wants to add?
I was going to give the example of ecotourism. So as I highlighted, ecotourism was one of the levers that we found actually strong evidence for poverty reduction. And obviously ecotourism is largely dependent on a globalized world. Most of these ecotourists are coming from international countries. Very few are domestic ecotourists. And so it's fantastic when it's working, but the flip side is that relying on a globalized market in a year of pandemic and these ecotourism sites are strapped for cash, they have no visitors, and all of a sudden a large portion of their income is now at risk. So that's sort of the pros and cons of a globalized world.
Thank you very much. Does any of the other speakers wants to contribute?
No, I can pick up on the next question
please,
if
Priya.
you want, but I also wanted to maybe comment or discuss why and have Reem sort of respond to this a little bit about why these payments, even when we make them specifically to communities to manage their forests better, why do they not reduce poverty? Right? It's you think that they would, because it's specifically targeted towards them. You're not leaving it to chance, markets and such. And my understanding is that that doesn't happen because you try to sort of meet the opportunity cost. So if a farmer has to change his or her behavior, reduce forest extraction a little bit, so the biodiversity increases, you pay them for whatever that is costing them. But you don't cover their transaction costs. Oftentimes they have to get together as groups, they have to put effort into monitoring each other, they have to go into town to collect the money, they have to do all these other things. And that itself is costly, and we tend to neglect that. And also that might, they might just break even. They're not getting, they're not building up the assets to enable them to get out of poverty. You need a little bit more than to break even if you have to get out of poverty. So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment because that's always a puzzle. And Reem, if you think that's appropriate, jump in, but I can also jump in on the carbon, the next question.
Oh, just to say, I agree in terms of a lot of these payments are they're going to compensate, but they're not necessarily going to compensate and add more for them to pull out of poverty. So they are contributing to overall well-being, they're contributing to incomes, but just not enough to get that push out. I think you're right in that sense, Priya.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. With that, I give the next question, Priya. Barbara, sorry,
yes,
Doris, you wanted to jump in. Sorry.
Yes, I wanted to just add one point on the globalization of markets. It really adds value to the product. However, it's important to also enhance the capacity of the local communities to be able to access those markets. And one of the areas is value adding. Oftentimes when a product gains global market, it's those who have the capital to take it all the way there that are able to benefit. So the benefits, very little benefits remain with the local communities. So it's important that capacity building also accompanies that very intentionally. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Doris, for this additional aspect. With that, we could try to respond to the next question. which is what can be done to speed up the values of forests to be included in the wide market, and also how can farmers easily access carbon markets.
Yeah.
I suggest Priya starts, and then our other speakers may add on.
No, I think Doris already got us started on that. I mean, there is this actual huge demand or growing demand. It's not, we don't know for sure that it's huge. For forest carbon markets, the volunteer market is, it seems, is growing, so there's demand, but there's not enough supply right now. In that, there's not enough areas of forests that can be guaranteed to offer sort of the additionality, permanence, and other considerations that would be required to ensure that these forests, if they are protected, will result in climate mitigation. For small communities to participate in this growing market, it's not going to be that easy, because they have to have the skills to do the kind of, you might be able to monitor at a certain level, but they also need to participate in this market in one way or the other. And you might need sort of philanthropic support to match the needs, to enable them to have the capacity to enter the market. That's what I want to say. I was talking to some colleagues who are working with women in Asia, in Papua New Guinea, and very concerned that while this market revolution seems to be happening, these women may not have the ability to do the work that is required. And so how do they may never be able to have the ability to do the work that is required for all the conditions to be met for that patch of forest to be used as for carbon purposes. So I think it's, in some ways it's exciting, and there is space for the social sector to help these communities, but in some ways one has to be skeptical about how useful this might be. Sort of, that's where I land, at least.
Thank you very much, Priya. Would any of the other speakers like to follow up? If not, I would have another.
No, just,
oh, sorry.
Just a
Monica, please,
word that, yes, as Priya pointed out, it's a very complicated process to reach out to the market, and transaction costs are very high. But sometimes governments can also provide support. Subnational and national governments might support farmers to get organized and produce proposals, for instance, for the Green Carbon Fund. But that's certainly out of the possibilities of a single farmer for the complexity involved. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I do have another question that's quite actual. What roles can forests and trees play to address the severe setbacks in poverty alleviation due to the COVID-19 pandemic? So I guess we do have some opinions on that. Who wants to start? I guess Priya had some.
Well, I think
some ideas about them.
I think what our understanding is that natural areas which offer resources to people as a safety net, including forests, but other areas as well, are already playing a role. You've had this large migration back to rural areas with lockdowns, and this has changed over the last year. So it's such a dynamic situation. It's happening again in some parts of the world. India, for example, tremendous problems right now. But in many cases, you saw this exodus from urban areas to rural areas. And what this means is two things. One is, dependence at the household level in these rural communities increases. If migrants are coming back, if they're not sending remittances back, so everything has to be supported at the village or community or household level in rural areas. And the natural safety net, it's not the most desired safety net, but it is often the natural safety net, is forests and other wild areas which people can rely on for food and other necessities. Unfortunately, this has meant in some cases that poaching has increased, and we've seen evidence of this, some quite publicized, so that people and the very reduction in tourists has meant that monitoring locally has also declined. So it's this it's a complex situation with increased reliance on forests and long-term implications for sustainability.
Thank you very much, Priya. Are there any other comments?
This is the question of the hour. Thank you for posing it. And I think we don't know the answer, but among this group, we have knowledge of the evidence base, which is mostly pre-COVID. But one thing that occurs to me is that the global pandemic is forcing us to question assumptions and rethink our priors and think new and think differently. I think young people in particular are leading in ways to kind of help see possibilities. So I think in the short term, and there needs to be much more research on this, but the kind of poverty mitigation as opposed to lessening is really probably the main function of forests in the pandemic, and they're being threatened. But longer term, the pandemic and people's relationship to forests might cause us to think anew. I'm thinking of things like, a conservation basic income is an idea that has been proposed by some, and we might think about that in relationship to forests, or policies to kind of backstop some of the market mechanisms that we've talked about that have been threatened by globalization. So when ecotourism fails, are there new regulations that could, somehow back that up, or new forms of insurance, social insurance could be developed. So I think that this moment, as difficult as it is, I'm not expecting myself, and I don't know about my fellow panelists, but that forests are more helping us maintain and just get by for now, helping particularly the poor that have, as Priya said, returned in many cases a home to a more forested area, but that the moment might be generative in other ways.
And I'd add, thank you, Dan, for sort of bringing the big picture to mind here. The risk of pandemics is higher the more fragmented land is, and the higher the population density in proximity to land. So deforestation offers a risk to, increases the risk of pandemics. So hopefully there will be some more thinking about, how do you manage forests better in order to reduce the risks to the poor and to everybody else. But we know that when you have some big event like this, the poor are hurt more than anybody else. So anything you do to reduce that risk will help with poverty mitigation and reduction.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for these excellent questions, and thank you panelists for these excellent responses, actually showing the big picture and what kind of role forests are playing in this global challenges at the moment. I just want to provide some information that the GFEP report on forest and poverty, which we are presenting today, is available for download at the IUFRO website, and you will find the web link posted in the chat. You can also order hard copies if you wish, free of charge from IUFRO headquarters. And with that, I would like to continue with our program, and we would like to share with you an early insight into an upcoming publication of IUFRO's GFEP program, an expanded policy brief on forest, trees, and poverty alleviation in Africa, which is based on our global report. Lead authors of the global report with specific expertise in Africa have distilled the findings focusing on the regional level, and they have added Africa-specific evidence in their analysis. And at the moment, about 200 stakeholders in different countries in Africa are being consulted and asked for comments on the draft of this policy brief. Their comments then will inform the revision of the document and the development of its final version. And I'm pleased now to introduce to you one of the authors and editors of the expanded policy brief, Dr. Doris Mutter. We have already seen Doris as a speaker on the panel. Dr. Mutter is a senior program officer at the African Forest Forum and will share with us the preliminary outcomes of this publication. Doris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Christoph. I have very few minutes, but I'd just like to take us through a very few slides on a policy brief, an expanded policy brief for Africa on forestries and poverty alleviation that is prepared based on evidence that you've already received from the other presentations by other panelists, but now focusing on Africa. So as we all know, Africa's forests are very important assets for Africa in the context of poverty alleviation. Africa's forests cover about 20% of the land area as indicated here. And these forests provide livelihoods for 250 million people, which is about 20% of the population in Africa. Those are those who live within 5 kilometers of forest, and they benefit from the forest in terms of forest goods and services. 20% of household incomes among this population is based on forest goods and services. When it comes to income also from employment, we have evidence that this range is fairly high, although you can see the formal-informal divide. There is less formal information on employment based on forests, and informal we have 260,000 up to 26,000 people employed. These are data based on Ghana, and you can see the difference between formal and informal employment levels, and this indicates that there are some income that are not declared at the national level, and this shows that it's actually much more valuable than we know formally in our current national estimates. And Africa Union has already identified forests as crucial for achieving prosperity for the continent based on the UN SDG 1 under the Africa Union Agenda 2063. This shows how important already politically we are focusing on forests to achieve prosperity through forest resources. So in this slide, we as the experts that have put together this, are putting together this policy brief, have looked at the various ways that forests address poverty, as you can see in this figure here, in terms of moving those who are extreme poor to above poverty line, and those who are poor to above poverty line. And this shows how the forest tree-based system contribute directly to these efforts, and a wide range of international organizations are already working with governments in Africa, civil society, and the private sector to tackle extreme poverty by addressing on the contribution of this forest to energy, food and nutrition, timber extraction, and NTAPs are very much prevalent, highly focused in Africa. We have examples of shea that have brought very interesting income raise for the community groups working on particularly in Burkina Faso. And also forests have also increased production gains in agriculture by having the presence of trees in agriculture and livestock systems, you're seeing that the communities are increasing their income in terms of gains in productivity and also loss of and reduced cost of inputs. Also, it contributes to fisheries as well. The situation in Africa in terms of poverty, as you can see here, this is a map that shows the level of people living below 1.9 US$ per day, and 41% of these live on less than $1.9 per day. This is data that we collected from an FAO report of 2015. And this represents 75% of the world's extreme poor, which is fairly high, whereas we know how much value the forests have. So it is important that governments in Africa also focus on forests as contributing to addressing these high poverty levels. So SDG 1, we have 2 targets. This has already been highlighted by Professor Miller on 1.4 on rights to land and natural resources, very important target that can be addressed through forestry, and also increasing resilience of the poor in the face of different kinds of shocks and disasters. We have just discussed about the COVID-19, and we can see how forests are assisting communities to survive when they have lost income from formal employment. And to this end, the Africa Union Commission already has identified forests as a key area, intervention area to address poverty in contributing to its prosperity of the continent. And a sustainable forest management framework was developed and already adopted by the heads of states that will help the governments of Africa to guide development of forests on the continent by all stakeholders. And this policy brief that we are preparing aims to demonstrate how forest and tree-based systems are central in achieving a prosperous Africa through poverty alleviation and contributing to Agenda 2063. So as been mentioned by my former panelists who are presented on contextual factors, the contextual factors in Africa are very much similar as anywhere else. The only difference is in the extent to which that they would affect the forest poverty dynamics. The social context is very much alive in Africa in terms of population dynamics, earth migration was already mentioned, environmental context, the location, climatic conditions are important factors to be considered, and the policy and the political context as well as the economic context of forest poverty dynamics. And strategies have already been studied based on studies that have been undertaken by the experts through the global assessment reports. We have identified some strategies. Rima already presented 21 levers that are already been studied, and they show to have impact on poverty alleviation. And in Africa, the same do apply. I have only picked a few that would actually be considered by governments, but they may not be the only one. They can be used either individually or in a combination with others. So we have rights-based levers that have been also mentioned in terms of tenure rights, clarity of rights, security of rights is an important factor that will enhance the contribution of forest to community level activities with regard to forestry. And financing is also a very key area that is very important in ensuring that governments and also stakeholders have sufficient resources to achieve benefits from the value chains of the various forest products and forest activities. And as Priya has already captured this, and I need not elaborate too much, but just to show that these scenarios also in Africa, the global context is very much alive in Africa. It has an impact on how our forests could contribute to poverty or not. And the business as usual scenario as presented here means that we risk increasing the poverty levels. And if we do contribute to interventions like capacity building, using increased financing, we have a good chance to improve poverty reduction and therefore enhance income for the local communities and contribute to the national economies of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doris, for this really comprehensive overview of our work on the expanded policy brief. The final publication of this expanded policy brief on forestries and poverty alleviation in Africa will be launched in July this year by IUFRO's GFEP program and will then be widely distributed to all stakeholders, decision makers who are interested in the subject matter. We are coming to an end of the session, but before we close the session, it's my pleasure to invite Mrs. Mette Leuke-Wilkie, Director of the Forestry Policy and Resources Division at FAO and Chair of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, to take the floor for concluding remarks. Dear Director Wilkie, please share with us your thoughts on the scientific work presented during our side event today.
Thank you very much, Christoph, and all panel members here for a fascinating storytelling about what is happening and what can happen around the world. I really enjoyed that. I've been listening in, and you haven't seen my video, but I've been listening into all of what you say. And I think it's so timely as well, because we know that in times of crisis that the forest and other natural resources really are the safety net for the poor. And we have seen this exodus from the cities to the rural areas due to the COVID pandemic. And we have estimation that this pandemic will push an additional 130 million people into poverty. It's a huge amount. So trying to understand what are the drivers into poverty and out of poverty is crucial, and to look to see what role forest may play in that is really important, that we do that, and that we do that now so that we can help influence the recovery process so that we do that in a better way. I was also very much excited by this presentation by Doris on Africa, and I'll tell you why. Because in addition to what you told us all about, Africa is the continent where the rate of deforestation is going up. Globally, it's going down from 16 million hectares per year in the 1990s to about 10 million hectares per year in the last 5 years. But in Africa, it is going up. And we know that the primary cause of deforestation in Africa is agricultural expansion, as it is worldwide. But in Africa, it's primarily small-scale agriculture. And that's why we need to focus on alternative livelihoods and finding better ways of using the natural resources in a sustainable manner. So I'm really looking forward to that expanded policy brief on Africa. The other statistic we have from Africa is that more than 90% of all the wood that's cut in the continent is used as wood fuel, primarily to cook the daily meals. Now, if we want to get people out of poverty, if we want to stop the degradation of the resources, the deforestation, the forest fragmentation, the land degradation, we have to find some solutions to that. So focusing on Africa makes an awful lot of sense. Also because we know that it's not going to continue to be just small-scale deforestation. We know that there's land grabbing going on. We know that there's a risk there will be large-scale commercial agriculture, has already started in some countries, but that's also coming in. So it's very, very important that we begin to put in place the enabling environment so that that does not happen in the same way that it has happened in other regions. So I really am very pleased that you're trying to focus on that continent to see what we can do there and take that going forward. And there are a number of opportunities. As you already said, there are a number of products, wood and non-wood forest products, value added that we can do, but we need to have that link between the producers, the small and medium scale enterprises, and the market, and selling this elsewhere. There are some great success stories about these superfoods or health foods, the very nutritious forest-based foods that you can have. And one of the things we want to start promoting here in FAO is plant-based foods from forest. We have a good program at the moment on forest wildlife, which is including also with bushmeat and making sure that traditional hunters can still maintain their way of life, and that we reduce the demand for wood for bushmeat in the cities instead, and provide them with alternatives. But I really think that if we look at sort of the plant-based foods that can come from forest, we have an opportunity here. But we need to link it in also with agriculture, with agroforestry, and with some better ways of finding alternative livelihoods that can help people get out of poverty, and not just make sure that they stay where they are and remain in poverty because we're not getting to that right level. So fascinating work. I really encourage you to continue to do that. And it does just show the value of what we have in this Global Forest Expert Panel, where we can have a deep dive into a specific topic with people from around the world, come up, use this as a think tank, and come up with some really valuable information that can then be taken forward into decisions and policies around the world. So I want to congratulate you on the report that you've already done, and I'm really looking forward to the expanded work from Africa and everything else that we heard here today. There's some fantastic work going on. So keep it coming, keep us informed so we can help promote it a bit better. I know this has been a quite intimate little event here, but I think there's a huge opportunity to spread the news much further than this and getting it into the right hands. So great work, all of you. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mette, for your insightful concluding remarks and for confirming that our work is important for the political level. Actually, this is also really good, because that's what we try to discuss with the scientific community, that this is really important to get out the word and to provide our knowledge and expertise to the decision makers. Yes, and with that, actually, we have to come to a close. It's already past the end of our meeting. As a sincere thanks to all speakers in this event, and I have also to say sincere thanks to all our donors, without whom none of the work presented today would have been possible at all. And I also want to say sincere thanks to each and every one of you for joining this side event. It's also important to have somebody who listens to us. With that, I say good day, good evening, and good night. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.